Well, good morning. It is Saturday, the 17th of September. So first off the bat, we can say that our slides are mislabeled because they say the 3rd of May, but we'll correct that. It's the 17th of September, the feast day of St. Hildegard of Bingen, the great mystic and composer and philosopher and all these other things. We have a gorgeous day today. We'll be restarting the Deacon School today with church history and Old Testament, both for those who are able to gather with us today and for the other members of this class who can't be here today, who are going to be watching this either some live and some recorded. So welcome. We will begin with prayer, and Paul will lead us in prayer.
Almighty God, we thank you for this opportunity to continue to learn about your work in the world before us in the past, all the saints before us and all the works in their lives and in the church. And we pray that we may look at our own lives and in our own world today and continue to study and to apply what we've learned. We thank you for Father Carl, for his dedication, for instruction. And we thank Grace Church and Grace Abounds for this opportunity to host this class. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Well, welcome, as I say. We're going to start out this morning with church history. This afternoon we'll consider Old Testament. Do not be alarmed by the number of the slides. In the past we've had 15, and now it's more like 21. We're going to breeze through some of these pretty quickly, and we've added a few more illustrations, so that's changed the number too. The amount of material we'll cover will be roughly the same, but if you've been reading through the book, you'll know that there's a lot that we're not covering. There's a lot of other material there. This is just a very, very broad area to cover. A couple caveats up front. We're talking essentially today about the origins of the church in America, taking us up into the 19th century. We'll talk a little bit about the background to that, what's coming out of Europe. We will, at our next class, have to go back and look at the influences of churches like the Roman Catholic Church in America. In order to make this a coherent narrative today, we're going to be mainly in the Protestant side of things. That's not to say nothing else is going on, but how this fits together is how it fits together. Once we get to the second half of the 19th century, we're starting today, we will end the class getting up to the origins of Anglo-Catholicism in the United States. That will take us into the second half of the 19th century, but we're going to have to come back and dwell there a little bit more at the next class to say what's going on in terms of the overall evolution of a broader understanding of the church in America. That will be one element that we'll just introduce today. But if we start out, first of all, if we go back and look at our last class coming out of the Reformation and all of the different strains coming out in Europe, we see that we start out the era of the settlement of America with Europe already in different camps. Religious camps, political camps, economic camps. What we will find looking at the church in America is today we are struck by the fact that there's such a wide pluralism in the Christian church, let alone between faiths. Just in the Christian church, we've got all kinds of flavors all over the United States. Different kinds of flavors that self-describe as Protestant or evangelical. Different centers of gravity in Roman Catholicism, different centers of gravity in Orthodoxy, a lot of non-denominational and congregational churches. What we'll find is that that level of pluralism is a hallmark of American Christianity from the get-go. From the time people first come to America, they are not on the same page religiously. And so let's go back and start out by saying that we have to first understand the political and doctrinal developments that are in the background here. Politically, we start out and we say that Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, is identified principally with Spanish, Portuguese, and French power. And the Catholic powers in the 16th century are focused on empire building. They're active in mission. They're sending missionaries out, notably Jesuits and Franciscans. And so we see in New Spain, for example, that there are priests and monks along with the conquistadores. We see St. Francis Xavier going to Japan and China. We see the establishment of Catholic missions in the East. This is part of the building up of the Spanish Empire or of the Portuguese Empire, the French less so. But there are people who are present with this, and it is considered as an identification between what the church is doing and what imperial policy is. Another difference there is that these Catholic missionaries are focused on the conversion of native peoples. And so from the beginning, whether it's in Africa or India or Latin America or China, the Catholics are focused on converting people to the Christian faith. Now, it doesn't mean everybody's immediately getting put in any kind of church hierarchy, but they are being converted, and some, in fact, do become clergy or religious. Obviously, there's intense rivalry between these imperial enterprises, and it is tempered only partially by papal intervention. Famously, the Pope intervenes and draws a line and says, east of here, the Portuguese have jurisdiction, west of here the Spanish have jurisdiction. That's when, for example, in Argentina and Paraguay, the Jesuits sort of big, well, we call them factories in an economic sense, but the big communities of indigenous peoples that are broken up. That's the story made famous in the 1986 movie, The Mission, with Robert De Niro. Protestantism, however, is identified with powers more intent on the establishment of colonies, not empire. So they're putting a viceroy in somewhere. They are mainly doing this as a mercantile expansion. When we talk about the Protestant work ethic and worldview, it's being lived out in this way. You start establishing areas in North America, for example, that aren't known as the colony of X, but as the X company, and it's got a board of directors sitting in London and has a royal franchise, and the Dutch are doing the same thing. The Dutch East Indies Company, the British East Indies Company, these are commercial enterprises that have governmental authority. They have their own navies, they have their own armies. It's not until 1858 that the British East India Company's military will be integrated into the military of the British Empire, and that the East India Company's governmental authority will be integrated into that of the British Empire. In North America, the Hudson's Bay Company will have actual jurisdiction for huge tracts of land. Rupert's Land will be the same. The Dutch East India Company does not integrate its military into that of the Dutch government until the 1930s. And it basically gets completed in the collapse around the Japanese invasion, and then never really gets reestablished as the Dutch Empire goes away. Yes?
Is this somehow paralleled with the idea of, the going away from monasticism in the Protestant faith, since it's such a Catholic thing, and then more focus on like parish churches?
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. What we're going to see as we move forward is the principal influence in American Christianity is going to be pietism, that we'll discuss in detail in slides 9 through 11. But it is a more individual faith. a faith more premised on an individual relationship with God. And personal practices of piety become very important that way. But as I say, Protestantism is identified with powers more intent on establishing colonies. And you, first of all, if we look at the German and Nordic Protestants, principally Lutherans, they're not too active in reaching out and establishing colonies. They are more focused inwardly on domestic rivalries and continental politics. Now, a lot of this is based just on geopolitics. Countries that tend to expand are those that are less threatened geographically. Great Britain is an island. It is protected. It can look outward. The Dutch are a maritime power. They have access to sea routes. The French, the Spanish, the Portuguese have access to the great sea routes, and to a limited extent are protected more by mountain ranges. The Germans and the Nordic powers generally don't have that ability to expand. For example, the Swedes could expand out into the Atlantic, but they got to get by the British. This has been the problem that the German Navy always had in World War I and World War II. The Germans have very long land borders that can be threatened from the east. They're more focused on what's happening at home rather than on building overseas colonies. You don't see Swedish colonies. You don't see Norwegian colonies. Of course, they're the same crown at that point. You don't see German colonies until, well, really the end of the 19th century. South Africa is established originally as two different colonies. One is principally Dutch and one is principally English, and that's going to end up in warfare in the 19th century. But those are again powers that are looking outward. Maritime powers establish overseas colonies and empires. Powers that are not maritime do not. You don't see a Russian empire overseas. In fact, the Russians will sell their overseas territory to the United States in the 19th century because they can't project naval power. This is the problem they still have. So at any rate, the English and the Dutch are focused outwardly on the establishment of colonies. These are maritime powers. And colonies involve the emigration of settlers and their religious communities, but there's little effort to convert the natives in the new land. This isn't the Spanish going out in an imperial venture and spreading the gospel. This is, we've moved over here and there are native peoples who are either friendly or hostile, but they're going to keep to themselves and we're going to keep to ourselves, maybe do some trade, but we're not going to go try to convert them. Well into the 18th century, there will be active debate in New England as to whether anybody should try to convert the natives. The disagreements that predominate, therefore, are over church polity. And this, of course, is the Reformation background. Is the church hierarchical and episcopal? Or is it just a gathering of people in common faith? What is the role of the crown? Is the church established or not? There are doctrinal disputes. The Catholic-Protestant divides over sacramental theology do become internalized as party positions in Protestantism. And so you get a wide variety of views over sacramental theology within Protestant churches. Then we get the rise of pietism in parallel with this. This is going to be something we'll discuss in more detail, slides 9 through 11. But this pietism involves an emphasis on individual salvation status over corporate identity. My relationship with Jesus Christ is what is most important, not how we are the church together. That's a gross oversimplification, but we're kind of going through background here. Pietism will be the greatest influence in the history of Protestant and Anglican spirituality in the 18th century. And it's a focus on the practice of piety, individual devotion, praxis pietatis. How do you live out your faith? How do you live out your faith on a daily basis in study, in prayer? How do you live out your faith on a daily basis in life habits? As you can see, it's still very much an important element in modern Christianity. Conversion of life, salvation becomes personal. When we hear evangelicals in our day and age talk about accepting Jesus Christ as my personal Lord and Savior, this is where this is coming from. It's not just that you were born into a Christian culture and baptized as a Christian and that makes you a Christian. You have to make an individual choice for Jesus Christ. Now, obviously that's not all bad or good, right? It's just what it is. It's going to end up being a very positive influence in American Christianity that will get hijacked a little bit in the late 20th century by how we focus too much now on individualism in the 21st century. So I've given you that background so we can say things are fractured to start with, and then we start out with a lot of different groups in different regions, and they're not on the same page. So let's start out in Virginia and the Middle Colonies. Outside of Virginia and the Carolinas and Maryland, Anglicanism is extremely rare. I mean, what? New England, we've got, what we call the Puritans, Congregationalists. Pennsylvania starts out as a Quaker franchise. New York starts out as a Dutch Reformed sort of franchise. So Anglicanism is a Virginia feature, a little bit in the Carolinas, a little bit less so in Maryland. Maryland will essentially be established as a Roman Catholic protectorate. Virginia and the southern colonies, however, are not founded as religious communities, but as merchant companies. It's one thing for a bunch of people to get in the Mayflower and sail and form the Plymouth colony and say they're going to build a new, shining city on a hill in the New World, and do that as an explicitly theocratic enterprise, saying God's in charge and we're going to run things that way. In Virginia, you've got people who are trying to make a buck, who are going overseas and seeing an opportunity to establish companies to trade with the riches of the New World. People of faith do show up, but that's not the basis of sending people. This is a time, however, when English identity is defined as Protestant, and religious zeal is defined to include a repudiation of popery and the evangelism of natives. So in Virginia, early on, people will start talking about how the native peoples might come to know Christ. That's not a feature of New England Protestantism in the same era. The native peoples in New England are referred to as the heathen and just to be kept separate. Now, the Virginia Company was founded by London merchants. The company's given a royal charter, but this slide is actually incorrect to say a royal franchise. Later on, Virginia will become a royal colony, but it starts out as a company with a royal charter. So let's correct that on the slide. Clergy are included in the colonization, but kind of as hangers-on. The Commonwealth will evolve into a royal colony, but in the absence of a resident bishop, church identity and authority is resident primarily in parish vestries. Remember, there's no bishop in the New World. And when we're talking about the Church of England, we're talking about an established state church where a bishop is variously addressed as Your Grace or My Lord and holds certain governmental authority through Parliament. In the absence of a bishop in America, and prior to the establishment of Virginia as a royal colony, this is still very much a commercial franchise. So vestries become important up front, although as we're going to see, parishes are so diverse geographically, so big, that the essential center for anything is going to end up being a plantation. And so again, there's a proprietary commercial basis to the society. The clergy who are there are basically under the patronage of large plantations or plantation interests. This is going to mean that when a slave economy evolves, very quickly, I'm using this in quotations because it's not the established church yet. The established church gets identified with slaveholding interests. Now, the Virginia colony becomes a political thorn to the crown. And these tensions are exacerbated by the founding of Maryland as a Roman Catholic franchise. Now, let's look at the time frame we're talking about here. When is Jamestown founded in Virginia? 1607. And so you used to have to know this in elementary school. Yeah, that was one of those dates you needed to know, like 1066 and 1492. And things come and go, and there are colonies that exist and fail. But essentially, the Virginia Company is going by the 1620s, about the same time that the Pilgrims go and found the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Plymouth Colony. What's happening in England? Well, we're in that whole long period leading up to the English Civil War, where we're still seeing tensions between, in 1581, Catholicism has been officially banned. You're a traitor, you know. Yes?
Isn't this also they don't have a true line of succession for the crown, right? Because Elizabeth doesn't have
right, the Scottish king has become the English king, James I. And there is fear that he's going to try to bring Catholicism back into the country. You get the whole rise of what we would call Stuart absolutism. It's going to end up with Charles I having his head cut off in 1649, Oliver Cromwell leading the Commonwealth until 1660, when Charles II assumes the throne and there's the Restoration. That's going to stumble along for a while until we get the so-called Glorious Revolution, when William and Mary end up on the throne. And you know, the English like to say they were invaded in 1066, but nobody's ever successfully invaded them since. That's not quite true. The Glorious Revolution is a Dutch invasion. Now, it's facilitated by English merchant class that welcome the troops coming on shore. But it is a definite, the Calvinists are in power sort of thing here. The whole 17th century in England, there's going to be a lot of back and forth tension that will result in civil war. We talked about that in the last class. And so in your colony over here, some of that is going to reflect crown politics. How do you position your colony as maybe an ace in the hole? How do they try to play off the internal politics in London? The colonial governor, we now have gotten to the point where Virginia's royal colony, Stuarts have established this, and the colonial governor in effect doubles down on established church identity. And so nonconformists and Catholics are told they're not really welcome in Virginia. In 1689, James Blair is appointed as an official representative of the Bishop of London. He's going to end up in Williamsburg, and he will be called something like a commissary for the Virginia colony. He goes about trying to reform the church in Virginia basically because it's so broken. Clergy rarely show up and do anything. In the absence of any episcopal visitation, there's no oversight on them. Some of them are living kind of the good life, shall we say. And the identity outside of the immediate sort of plantation chapels and town chapels is most unchristian in most cases. Now, what do you really need to be able to do to be a good practicing Anglican? Well, there was a cynical answer. What you need to be able to do is read. It's a prayer book-based way of faith. So if you've got people who've come to the colonies because they're trying to carve a new, world for themselves, and they've come as indentured servants or something, literacy could be a challenge. And if you're going to light out for the territories, literacy could be a challenge. If you're a prayer book-based practice of the faith, this means you are narrowing your base to start with. There are very few disputes in Virginia over doctrine and polity because the clergy and the lay people are basically indifferent to the practice of the faith. Faith is just sort of a cultural identification. Sound familiar? How many people do we have in our nation today who self-identify as Christians, but kind of never darken the door of a church? It's a cultural identification. Unlike the separatists, the Pilgrims, those who are up in New England, Anglican identity is not focused on individual zeal and piety. It's just, you're a member of the society and this is the way the society works. This lack of an active church life allows the tobacco culture, which is starting to evolve in Virginia, and the concomitant need for African labor to rise in parallel. There is no New England Protestant ethic in Virginia. It's a lot easier to just import chattel labor, and so slavery becomes institutionalized. By 1667, the House of Burgesses, which is the legislature of the colony, declares, "Baptism doth not alter the condition of the person as to his bondage or freedom." And they It does from a religious perspective, but they're making a legal pronouncement. They liberally misquote Paul's letter to Philemon to say that this somehow supports slavery. That will become a theme in Southern preaching into the 19th century, that Paul is condoning slavery and saying that's the way it works. Those of you who've read Philemon, we had it as our lesson 2 weeks ago, New Testament lesson. If you paid attention, that's clearly not what he's doing when he tells Philemon to receive Onesimus as his beloved brother. But at any rate, they're saying that since Paul has sent Onesimus back to Philemon, he's saying this is the way it works, that slavery is okay. I don't see any of the tobacco planters treating their slaves as beloved brothers in Christ. There would be exceptions to all rules. Now, the problem is complicated by geography. How do you form a unified church culture when everybody's so spread out? Plantations and not parishes become the focus of the community. So where we're going to leave it for now before we move on, and we'll come back to Virginia obviously, is this is a cultural identity. It's not what we would call an active faith, and of course there are exceptions to that rule as well. There are clearly people with an active faith in Virginia in the 17th century, but they're not the norm. In Maryland, we get the place founded as a proprietary colony, 1634, under Lord Baltimore. This is the Calvert family, which is one of the big old recusant families in England. These are people who are powerful enough and rich enough to remain Roman Catholic and pay all the fines entailed with that. And so Anglicanism is effectively absent in the 16th century in Maryland. In the 18th century, you start getting the rise of an Anglican constituency amongst landowners beholden to the proprietary family, because the Calverts convert to Anglicanism in 1732. So back in England, the Calverts go back to the C of E, or they convert to the C of E, And so now the people who are beholden to the Calverts, the landowners who hold by virtue of the Calverts' right and title, start moving in that direction as well. So the Virginia land-owning culture of the church starts becoming more of a feature in Maryland in the 18th century. Maryland just blends into that Virginia, Carolina, Georgia model of a sort of passive Anglicanism, but with a notable Catholic population in Baltimore. Now, the colony's laws, unlike those of Virginia, do not establish any church, and you get paid a lot more. Don't know why. We could go back and research that. And so Anglican clergy who come to Maryland tend to focus less on mission and more on preferment. How do I get by doing as little as possible and getting paid as much as possible? This is the sweet gig if you were a worldly clergyman in America in the 18th century. Again, Anglicanism is a cultural, not a religious force. Which takes us to New England. Big contrast. Now, as we talked about in our last class last spring, these are not Puritans. Puritans are a particular church party in England. We call them Puritans in New World usage and American usage, but they come out of that theology. These are separatists, however, the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Plymouth Colony. They want to found a theocracy in America. If you remember what you were taught in elementary school about the Pilgrims, you usually heard that they were escaping religious persecution. The fact of the matter is they wanted to establish a separate theocratic state. They first actually went where? To Holland. They didn't originally go to America. The Huguenots would also be Calvinists, but they were sort of a French-German group. The Puritans, like the Huguenots, were Calvinists, and they held a very low view of the church and opposed church hierarchy. Now, when I say low and high, remember we're talking about the church as a holy mystery unto herself, necessary for salvation as opposed to individual response. If you wanted to have the prototypical statement of a high church view, if you were to quote St. Cyprian, who died in 258, his feast day was this past week, the 13th of September, he said, "You cannot have God as your father if you do not have the church as your mother." In other words, the church is necessary to salvation. A low view would say, no, the church is just how we're organized and how we get together and how people get educated and how we come together to worship, but I can do this on my own. And I don't need anybody in authority over me. So the separatists have a low view of the church, and they're opposed to church hierarchy. They're happy to establish a theocratic government, the way the Calvinists do in Geneva, for example, or Zurich, where the town government says how things happen in church. That's what they do in New England. They first go to the Netherlands. They're trying to get away from the Stuarts, who are asserting royal prerogative and trying to push the established Church of England down their throats. And this, of course, is the same time when Archbishop William Laud is pushing a very high church view of how you're going to be living in England. Laud is one of those fun characters who gets to the point of having people's ears cut off if they don't listen to him. He is on our calendar of saints, so we can see how there is a broad latitude in some of these things. I don't know. There's a window to William Laud at Nashotah House, for example. Between William Laud and Charles I, however, and despite their many, many faults, we do have to understand that episcopacy as a feature of Anglicanism would have died absent those two. And so they are remembered for preserving church hierarchy and both, paying the price for that. Now, when the separatists come over to Massachusetts, they're not accompanied by any clergy. Why do you need clergy? You're all, in this together. There won't be any for the first 9 years. Religious leaders are political leaders. Massachusetts and Connecticut are founded as holy commonwealths. Now, within the first generation, they're sitting there saying, well, we need to kind of, up our game here a little bit in terms of how church is done. So Harvard is founded in 1636 to train clergy. The Holy Commonwealth model, however, is threatened by any dissent. And so the founding of Providence Plantations, Rhode Island, flows directly from this legacy of separatism. Roger Williams shows up, and he's a clergyman in a Boston church, but he doesn't think that people have separated themselves enough. And so he expects the church in Boston to repudiate all connections with the Church of England, say they're hellish, etc., and to repent of any past connection. The fact that you came out of England, the fact that you were ever connected with Anglicanism, you have to repent of, or you're not a real Christian. That's actually a bridge too far for the separatists in Boston, and Williams goes to what becomes Rhode Island, and it becomes a haven for dissenters. Early center for Baptists and for Quakers.
Never heard that list.
Yeah, if you look, the official title of the state is the state of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. If you look on their Great Seal. This legacy of separatism results in the rise of Congregationalism as opposed to Presbyterianism. Now, what's the difference? Presbyterianism is founded on the idea of presbyters, elders, and so you have a regional synod of some kind, a consistory that sits there and says what's happening in the churches between congregations. The separatists have this separatism in their blood, and so they become more congregationalists and say, well, here's how we do it in our congregation. Now, they do try to agree on things and say how we're all essentially maybe Calvinistic this way, but we're self-governing. This results in the Cambridge Synod in 1648, where if you're going to label yourself as a Congregationalist Protestant, here are the sort of baseline things you need to agree to or agree with. In our own day and age, we see churches that are styled as Reformed Church in America or United Churches of Christ. UCC comes out of the Reformed tradition. And so while there's wide variety in liturgy, for example, and theology in UCC churches, they come out of the Reformed tradition, and so they tend to have a more Reformed liturgy and piety. They are a legacy of this congregational theology of the founding of New England. As New England Christianity matures, evangelical piety and zeal decline. I mean, you've gotten in a boat and come across the Atlantic Ocean, and people have died from disease, and there have been all these things to found the city shining on a hill, and now your kids are 20 years old, and they're like, they didn't do that. They think you're just a little bit, too all in on this, and they're just trying to make a crop and get by. And this raises a critical issue for the colony. Must church membership be compulsory? The second and third generations are in external covenant only. They haven't signed the covenant to come over and found the colony. They haven't signed all the things they're going to do. They're in external covenant in that they're part of the colony. But have they come and, made an individual, commitment to Christ and signed the covenant, things like that? And so the question becomes, when you present your child for baptism here, are they part of this or not? And this is going to be a back and forth debate in New England for about 40 years. Well, less than that. It doesn't really rise for the first 20. And we get what's called the halfway covenant in 1662, which allows for baptism and says, you're a Christian, you're a member of the church by virtue of your baptism, but you don't have any rights unless you truly enter into the covenant. So you're halfway in. That's why it's called the halfway covenant. But this just results in further church splits, because some congregations say, no, my boy is fully in, you know? And so congregationalism evolves pretty rapidly. But then, horror of horrors, to complicate things matter, we get royal restoration. You've gone away as separatists to found your own city shining on a hill, and now you've got crown power again. By the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Plymouth colony, the New England Covenanters are beset by a reassertion of royal power, pestilence, shipwrecks, the Boston Fire, and King Philip's War. Net result is about a third of the colony is now dead, and a lot of people are destitute. So everybody gets together. You do this by pamphleteering and say, what's the problem? Why is this happening? And the answer is, it's because we're not being faithful enough. We've got to double down on this separatist model. We get this tract, The Necessity for Reformation, to say, the reason you've had the plague and smallpox, the reason you've had shipwrecks, the reason the crown has shown back up is you're not being faithful. And so you've got to be more faithful as the original people who got on boats were. Now, let's move on to the Carolinas and Georgia. We talked about this a little bit in the context of Virginia. There are actually some differences from the Virginia model. These are colonies founded on a purely mercantile basis. The proprietors are nominally Anglican, but basically they're there to make some money, and so liberty of conscience is the rule. These are adventurers. These are people who are fighting pirates. Some of them are pirates themselves. These are people who are there to say, how do we make some money? And they're threatened on their southern extremes by who? The Spanish and Catholicism. So they're always trying to just decide what is the way we're going to get by.
Wasn't Georgia founded by criminals?
Yes. You know, Georgia, there were a lot of criminals sent there. So, you know, you get almost an Australian model there of this is truly the wilderness, and how people put together religious communities, regardless of their individual faith, is not a primary focus. Now, once you get a slave economy, and you start getting the, you know, ships taking slaves to America and taking rum and cotton to England and taking specie to Africa and all that sort of, once you get that economy going, you get a port like Savannah becoming wealthy in Georgia and building big Anglican churches. But again, it's a very mercantile society. Legislative efforts are undertaken to establish the church in North Carolina, but they fail. There's just essentially pushback on that. In South Carolina, the church is established. The Church of England becomes established in Charleston, but within 2 years, it is repealed in London by the Crown and the House of Lords, because it raises too many issues of church polity. Do we need to therefore send a bishop to America? Because of strong laws in Virginia, punitive taxes against nonconformers, dissenters tend to migrate to the Carolinas. And so you get Baptists and Presbyterians becoming more prominent. Presbyterianism shaped primarily by the Scotch-Irish from Ulster. So if you look at our modern identity as Americans and think of the Carolinas and Georgias, you've got, you know, that Scotch-Irish identification, this sort of Protestant Celts and Baptists, and, you know, you can start seeing where regionalism really gets going from an American religious and mercantile basis. There is generally an absence of trained and dedicated clergy, And this is accompanied either by lay indifference among Anglicans or lay zeal, which is more personal and congregational amongst dissenters. Anglicanism, to the extent that it becomes a cultural force, is established by the culture and by political patronage. And we all can still point to parishes in this part of the world that's where you want to be a member of a church if you're going to do this politically or this in terms of making some money. Now, going on, what about New York and New Jersey? Well, they're not marked by any unifying social, political, or economic outlook. Cultural and religious pluralism are the norm. New York is initially established as a Dutch franchise, but pretty quickly the English invade. And James, Duke of York, the brother of Charles II, is granted most of the middle part of the eastern seaboard as a personal franchise. He basically negotiates the surrender of Neuf-Amsterdam, New York, in 1664 because he has a powerful enough fleet lying off Manhattan, and the Dutch don't have sufficient defenses. They eventually cut a deal. There is a Dutch sort of mercantile colonial culture in parts of New York and New Jersey under those known as the patroons, who are kind of what we'd consider to be feudal lords. There's slavery in New Jersey and New York. I personally have been in a Dutch Reformed church in West Orange, New Jersey that had a slave gallery because the tobacco farmers had slaves in the 17th century. That'll go away by the 18th century. James tolerates the Dutch, and in 1672 he converts to Roman Catholicism. You can see how back during the English Civil War, everybody who was sort of suspicious of the Stuarts, they were like, aha, here's the king's brother now becomes a Roman Catholic. And so he very quickly tolerates Catholics in New York.
Did he live in America?
He came here. He did not live here long. He was back and forth as, like, you know, bring military expeditions in, make some money, and move on. Now, the separatists to the north in New England, and there's some out on Long Island as well, across the Connecticut Sound, they view New York with grave suspicion because in New York, church life is feeble and discontinuous well into the 18th century. They're constantly shifting boundaries and minimal enfranchisement. So the New Yorkers are just like those New Yorkers who are there to make a buck and, you know, serve sin. Nothing really has changed, right? You know, except that New Englanders no longer look on New Yorkers that way. The rest of the country does, in the Deep South maybe. You know, but there is religious fervor amongst the Dutch Reformed in the Netherlands, but very little of this translates into the New World. Who are we talking about here? People who have left their native culture. They're going to try to start something new, and many of them are going to try something new because they don't fit in at home. I don't want to paint with too broad a brush here, but anybody who spent time in Alaska will say there are a lot of people there who just don't want to be in the lower 48. And this is...
In reality, most of these people are desperately trying to stay alive, you know.
Yeah, if you're trying to stay alive...
Put on a shelf for a while, you know, it's not one of their priorities.
If you're trying to hack out an existence in the wilderness, it's not the highest priority. If we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you know, food and shelter are coming in first here. So you get Dutch Reformed zeal, but it's not a feature in the New World. And so the people who are moving, who are emigrating, are not doing this for religious reasons. That's what happened with the separatists in New England, but that's not a feature of other emigration. It's for commercial opportunity or a new life or to get away from the bailiff or something. New York before James shows up is kind of a sideshow for the Dutch West Indies Company. You'll note it's a company, not a colony. No minister is provided for the first 5 years. This is kind of like, how many ministers and chaplains are there on large deep water oil rigs in the North Sea? I don't know. But I suspect to the extent there are, they're few, and probably not just provided by the company. Maybe the Seamen's Union provides somebody to come out. But you know, if you go out and work on a big oil rig, the Goliath off of the Norwegian coast or something like that, you're there to spend a lot of time working very hard and making a lot of money, and a lot of other things are secondary. That's the new world. The Dutch Reformed Church is a marginal presence in New York, but it will actually be established in New Jersey because New Jersey is a county palatine, which is a technical term for a self-ruling territory that has certain rights apart from the rights of the crown. In England, for example, the border counties were palatine. They had rights that the crown couldn't assert against them, and you do this with border counties because they're on a military footing too often. They got to fight the Scots or something like that. So you give them some home rule. New Jersey has a limited home rule status, and so because you get dissenters coming out of the north and from the south, you tend to attract some of them, and Quakers. And even some separatists show up when there's a weak attempt to establish Anglicanism in New York. New York in this period is notable mainly for the absence of any church services. Yeah, it's just...
They were also fighting Indians, you know?
Right. I mean, there are a whole bunch of things going on in the frontier, as I say. So, this is a review. This isn't a criticism, okay? This is a review to say, what are the cultural and religious forces here? Pennsylvania is an exception. Pennsylvania is founded as the Holy Experiment, as a Quaker venture. The colony is a proprietorship of William Penn, founded explicitly as an experiment in religious, social, political, and economic engineering. Tolerance and pluralism are made explicit. This is why German Lutherans moved there. And what we to this day call a Kentucky rifle is actually a Pennsylvania rifle made in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where all the German gunsmiths go. They go there because their form of Christianity, Lutheranism, is explicitly tolerated. They couldn't move to Boston. They wouldn't be welcome there. They couldn't move to Virginia except to the extent that people want to buy rifles. The religious freedom, representative government, cheap land, and feudal proprietary arrangements are impressed as founding principles. Now, notwithstanding this toleration, the Society of Friends, the Quakers, are very much in charge in Philadelphia. But immigration brings a steady stream of Scotch-Irish, they'll be Presbyterians, right? And Germans, who'll be Lutherans. And so we get them becoming more prominent in Pennsylvania. And the German presence is the first significant advent of Lutheranism in the New World. Quakerism evolves on the basis of schism, what's called Keithism. These are Quakers who are saying you're not being strict enough. You're not being good Quakers. And so they don't want to be quite so tolerant of other things and start forming their own meeting houses. And then it also evolves on the basis of an increased practical focus, an increased mercantile focus. People are starting to make money. Philadelphia is becoming a more established place as a port. And people are making money, and they're getting more comfortable, and they're building better houses, and that religious zeal is going a little bit to the background. In the post-World War II America, as we saw an increase in consumer spending, we saw a decrease in the practice of faith, the same process. Couple important crises arise. You get a smallpox epidemic in Philadelphia. I once got to deal with at the Mutter Museum of the Philadelphia College of Physicians and Surgeons, they have a body in a glass case. It was a smallpox victim in the 18th century, buried in what is now Tinicum Marsh, and very rich tannic acid environment in the marsh, and the body was turned into soap. And when I was there at age 13 on a field trip, I didn't believe this story, and the curator in the Motor Museum opened the case and took a tiny piece off, and it lathered. Do that now on a 7th grade school field trip, right?
Was Keith an individual?
Yes, he was a Quaker minister in Philadelphia.
Okay.
Yeah, Richard Keith. So you get Keithism. But you get a couple other crises here. You get the French and Indian War, which is known in European history as the 7 Years' War. This precipitates a withdrawal and return of the Quaker establishment to the meeting house. They're not pushing west anymore. General Braddock's forces have been bushwhacked near Fort Duquesne by the French and Indians and decimated. And this is why General Braddock's aide-de-camp, George Washington, thinks that rifles are really important and why they will become a feature in the Continental Army as against muskets. So, yes?
So I never heard about this connection before I read this in Macaulay with this worldwide fight between the French and the English, and it's not just in England, but it's here in the colonies. It's in other parts of the world. Wherever there are English and French, they're fighting each other.
Right.
And that starts to set that. I never thought about that setting the stage, and I don't think he points it out, but I'm thinking in my head it kind of makes sense, the setting the stage of, okay, why are we looking to a foreign power here that's, you have to pay taxes, but not just that, but then they're also like influencing, now we have to go to war for their causes and stuff like that. So it makes sense in 1754 to 63. That's not too far away from the American Revolution.
You can see where it's heading.
Yeah.
And the British, particularly in New England at this point, are going to be really kind of acting like, well, the colonists haven't done enough to defend themselves, and we've been pouring royal treasure in here in the form of troops and all that stuff to fight the French, and we don't think they've done enough. And that's where all these taxation acts are going to come from. The intolerable acts that include the Stamp Act and the taxing of tea and things like that are because of all the money they've spent on the 7 Years' War. They're trying to retire debt. They're trying to say, you guys need to pull your own weight. The colonists think they really pulled their own weight, and now you're giving us punitive taxation. And what becomes one of the intolerable acts? Well, that's the next page here. If you look at the map, one of the intolerable acts is the Quebec Act of 1774. Now, if you look, it's hard to see on this screen, but all of this green over here, here you've got the American colonies. All of this is Quebec, which the British, in the course of trying to, realign post-fighting the French worldwide all this time, have said, since we won in North America and we control Quebec now, how do we prevent a big revolt in North America from the French and a renewal of the war in Europe? And they passed the Quebec Act that says Roman Catholicism is tolerated and can be established in Quebec. Well, if you're a New England Protestant type who came over as a separatist to get away from the crown, and you now say that all of your Western expansion opportunities have been cut off, and you're now threatened by what you perceive to be a hostile power, French Catholicism, you view this as unacceptable. If you add on to that the taxation issue, if you add on to that whatever, you can see how the colonists are rapidly growing apart from the crown. Allied with that is the cartoon on the left from the Political Register in London in 1769, the attempt to land a bishop in America. You'll see that the bishop who is clinging to the rigging here is saying, "Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace." And in New England, a bishop is viewed as an agent of the crown. So here are the same folks here who are, you know, basically going to throw tea into the Boston Harbor. They're about ready to tar and feather any bishop who... There are a couple attempts to say, why don't we get a bishop? And it's the hue and the cry is raised. Nobody ever actually gets on a boat and goes to the New World. This will become a major issue post the Revolutionary War. What do you do as the Episcopal Church? And we'll see how that becomes. You have to send Samuel Seabury to England. Well, that's Methodism. But Samuel Seabury will be sent to England eventually. And he cannot be consecrated a bishop in England because that requires an oath of allegiance to the crown. So he goes to Scotland, which has disestablished the church, and is consecrated a bishop by the Scottish bishops, but they say, we'd like you to use our prayer book. So we end up with a version of the 1662 book that becomes our 1789 book via Scotland, and it's actually a better book, so we got a good deal out of that. 1/3 of all Anglican clergy at the end of the American Revolutionary War will leave the colonies, principally go to Atlantic Canada. Now, we like to think of this just as George Washington and people doing stuff. 1/3 will leave because they either identify with the crown or they're run out of town on a rail. The old Tory establishment in the Northeast is persecuted and disenfranchised, and their land is seized and things like that. And so if you're part of that old proprietary Anglican model, you might have to get out of Dodge and go to Atlantic Canada or back to England. We're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to start talking about pietism. We are back, and here we are talking about pietism. We're going to switch gears here. We've been talking about all the things that have been going on culturally and politically, and the fractured regional nature of Christianity in America at this time, North America. And now we're going to talk about something that does start happening doctrinally and does start happening in the movement of the Holy Spirit, and how the nature of faith in America is going to be very much influenced by this. Pietism, awakening, revival. If things are just cultural, if we're just getting along and we're just cultural Christians, what do we try to do in 21st century America with folks around us who are just, quote, cultural Christians? Well, we want them to have conversion of heart. We want them to get in with both feet. We want them to get, involved and say, Jesus is important and how I'm following him. That's what this is about, pietism. The definition here involves the protest of a living faith against a lifeless and unbending orthodoxy. Now, this is aimed by Protestants against other Protestants. This isn't complaining about Catholicism. This is about the church as a Protestant phenomenon. And so we see an effort to keep alive the spiritual dynamic of the Reformation without losing sight of doctrinal principles. The principle of reform is extended to the practicalities of personal life. Most people aren't going to sit down and read all of the Institutes of Religion by Calvin, right? They're not going to be into nuanced sacramental theological arguments. They're not going to be sitting there focused on all of the doctrinal disputes that are going on within Protestantism so much as saying, how am I supposed to live my faith out? Same problem we deal with in most churches today. Now, the main emphases, we're painting with a broad brush here, the main emphases in pietism include the personal over the institutional, the voluntary over what is compulsory, the present versus tradition with a small t, how we've always done things, not tradition as a theological position. The rights of laity over clergy, and so there's an anti-hierarchical vein here. Transconfessional unity amongst true believers. Well, it doesn't matter if you go to a different church, we're all Christians. Jesus says that they would all be one flock. The primacy of experience over the knowledge of doctrine. You can put a star next to that one, and next to number one. The personal, because it becomes personal experience. And so the personal and the primacy of experience, that's what matters. How do I feel about this? What have I experienced? Perfectionism is a factor, less so today than when pietism began. But this is, I have to work at my faith. I have to strive to be a better Christian. I have to strive to follow Jesus, and I have to do that every day. Now, what are the main effects? We're going to take this apart a little bit as we go on, but what are the main effects? Well, there's a revival of dynamic preaching. You have to actually persuade people, or try to. The pastor has to be visible as an example of godliness and witness. Can't just be sort of a cultural force who is an office holder. There is a flowering of devotional literature. This started much earlier with people like Thomas à Kempis, but if you're worried about how do I live my faith out, this is kind of a daily thing, There's missionary zeal. I'm supposed to convert other people. I'm supposed to testify to my faith. That's how I'm supposed to live it out. There's social outreach. And so abolitionism comes out of pietism. William Wilberforce and people like that are very pietistic and saying, slavery is, an evil. And so what do we do about it? We're called to do something about it because of our identity as Christians. We can't just be fellow travelers. We have to do something. We get the Sunday school movement. People need to know more. People need to be developed in their faith. This is an ongoing project. We get an increased emphasis on education in church schools. We have to form people. It's an active, not a passive model. There's an emphasis on lay involvement. There's an ecumenical concern. Well, if we all confess what's in the Apostles' Creed, is that good enough, right? There is a revival of hymnody. Now, why would that be important? We're asking people to sing hymns and express their faith through, it's not the priest up there singing a prayer. It's not the minister up there just preaching. You're doing something, and you're using words and talking about your faith. Now, there are many, many, many examples, but I've picked out two that really kind of illustrate some of the theology here. We've got Jesus, Lover of My Soul by Charles Wesley, and Jesus, All My Gladness by Johann Frank. And I've actually given you on the next page the words to these. Now, we could sing these. We could make it a class project to sing these right now. Yeah, let's look at the first verse and talk about, it's personal, my soul, going to be in Jesus' bosom. Jesus, lover of my soul, let me to thy bosom fly, while the nearer waters roll, while the tempest still is high. Hide me, O my Savior, hide, till the storm of life is past. Safe into thy haven guide, O receive my soul at last. Now, look at that first stanza and just circle every time it says my and talks about me being with Jesus. Go on. Other refuge have I none. Now, the story behind this, incidentally, this particular poem was written by Wesley when he was hiding in a ditch from a mob that was trying to kill him, seeking him to kill him. He had been doing some open-air preaching, and they took exception to that in Northern Ireland. And he was in a creek bed up underneath the bank, and these words were brought to him. Other refuge have I none. Hangs my helpless soul on thee. Leave, ah, leave me not alone. Still support and comfort me. All my trust on thee is stayed. All my help from thee I bring. Cover my defenseless head with the shadow of thy wing. That's when you're in a hard place. Goes on though. Plenteous grace with thee is found. Grace to cover all my sin. If we look at Johann Frank here, a German pietist, Jesus, all my gladness, my repose in sadness. Jesus, heaven to me, ah, my heart long plaineth, ah, my spirit straineth, longeth after thee. Thine I am, O Holy Lamb, only where thou art is pleasure, thee alone I treasure. Again, me, I, my, and Jesus. This is the me and Jesus thing going on here. Very personal presence of the Lord, and very personal in how I reach out to him.
Even outside of just the me and my's all the time, there's not a whole lot of you or your in reference to the Lord or Jesus too, and like you would often hear in Psalms talking about God's mercy or God's attributes to God. So yeah, there's still always that it's not just a relationship, but also very much.
And we use a name. We're calling him Jesus.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
and it's like we're reaching out, and so pietism. These are just examples. You can find a whole bunch of pietistic hymns in our hymnal. It becomes principally a feature in Methodism. And, you know, you would find Anglican priests in the period between the 1950s and the 1980s, when we had a certain cultural, place that was more established, and if they wanted to teach a seminary on how to get things done in a parish, they'd say, well, preach C.S. Lewis and sing Charles Wesley and you'll be okay. People will be happy, you'll be fine. Nothing wrong with C.S. Lewis, nothing wrong with Charles Wesley. I mean, one of the reasons I picked these hymns is they're some of my favorites, but you can see how it really personalizes it and makes it very much who I am in Christ. Now, Pietism is a force in Lutheranism, in Reformed Protestantism, and Anglicanism. Faith is experienced through feeling. In Lutheranism, there's an increased emphasis that works must accompany faith. We get Article 6 in the Augsburg Confession all the way back in 1530. Because remember, Luther is so focused on salvation by faith alone that works is kind of a dirty word, and maybe we'll get the letter of James out of the Bible, right? That's painting with a broad brush. But, there's the idea that works must accompany faith. By the 17th century, this reaction against an individual and sola fide, by faith alone focus, has evolved into what is called the pia desideria, the way of faith, of Philip Spener, who's considered the father of Pietism. Laity gathered in prayer and Bible study. This is going to be the foundation of how we do faith, right? Pietism is shaped into a movement by August Franke in Halle, and the University of Halle becomes an early center of this in their theological school. The personal experience of new birth is central to faith. In other words, we start talking about conversion. Conversion is not just a theological term, it's something we talk about and describe, and how conversion works, and how we can seek conversion, and how we can see it in other people, and how we can develop it, and, very much a part of the background language in the church that we know. German Pietism is shaped principally by Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf and the Herrenhut, the God House. Zinzendorf and the Moravians, who are descendants of the Hussites we talked about in our last series of classes, they're going to be major influences upon the Wesleys and the rise of Methodism. The Wesleys are going to travel to the Herrenhut. When the Wesleys come over to Savannah, Georgia, they're going to be on a ship with Moravians. And they're going to say, hey, this whole bit about singing hymns is kind of cool. And of course, Charles has the great gift of a hymnodist and starts writing a bunch of hymns, writes hundreds of them. But Pietism, as it affects Anglicanism in the Wesleys, comes out of Germany. And now there are precursors in Holland. You get, the devotional movements like the Beguines. You get Thomas à Kempis, certainly. But this is a continental force that now enters English Christianity.
Who's the one that did the Litany of the Wounds?
Litany of the Wound. I'm not sure I can just remember.
I'll have to look that up. That was in the book, and they talked about how it was this dedication of all of the wounds of Christ.
Christ's wounds.
And then there was some reference to something about the side wound or something.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, I remember, but I don't remember who wrote
Yeah.
it. So we can look it up. Which takes us to Methodists. The Methodists are a religious society, both within and outside, eventually, the Church of England, with a focus to revive piety and combat vice. Now, if Anglicanism is mainly a cultural force, clearly there's a broad tolerance on things that a more strict Christian would consider to be vice. You're sitting there in Oxford University. In the 18th century, not everybody is holy in their zeal or in their behavior, right? The Methodists arise as a reaction to this passive cultural 18th century Anglicanism. And the first Pietists in England actually precede the Methodists. You get Thomas Bray, who founds the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge in 1696, the SPCK. They're still around. They have wonderful bookstores in England. They have wonderful publications. They were very active in 19th century mission, sending people. If you look at Africa today, you can kind of see differences in Anglican provinces on the basis of whether they were first evangelized by the SPCK or the SPG. SPCK is very pietistic. SPG starts out there but becomes more Anglo-Catholic. And so you get the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. As I say, one remains very pietistic, one becomes much more Catholic, both founded by the same guy. The SPCK and the SPG are focused on foreign mission and on free primary schools, the distribution of Bibles, prayer books, and devotional literature, and preaching in workhouses. Now, why do they get focused on schools? Well, if you're going to distribute Bibles and prayer books and devotional literature, people need to be able to read. So they kind of work back upstream and say, why don't we work on schools? Because there is no free public education. So they start that movement. Preaching in workhouses. Okay, if you're dealing with people who can't read, you have to really preach. Bray ends up being named as commissary to America by the Bishop of London. So he's sent to the Virginians. Only stays 2 years in Virginia and decides that they're all so unfocused on faith that he's wasting his time. But I've given you pictures of the Wesleys here. John and Charles, they formed the Holy Club at Oxford. They're also known by their fellow students as the Bible Moths, and finally they're called the Methodists because of their method of gathering, of studying, and of praying together. They are sons of a high churchman, Samuel Wesley. Their brother Samuel will be notable as a composer. We have sung an anthem by Samuel Wesley in this parish, which is based on which psalm here? Oh, based on 51. So we start out with that awful high note for a bass. Wash me thoroughly from my wickedness. That's Samuel Wesley. But the father is actually a high church churchman who is, however, focused on piety, free grace, and the pardon of sin. John is gifted with organizational skills, and Charles is gifted as a preacher and a hymnodist. So all of the elements are there. The Wesleys traveled to America with the Moravians. They've gone to the Herrnhut, they've contacted Zinzendorf. Zinzendorf comes to America. So they decide, well, we'll go with them. They get this experience of hymnody on the ship. And the Moravians challenge the Wesleys. Do you know Christ as your personal Lord and Savior? They're coming from a high church environment. They're coming from Oxford. It's like, here's how we do things as prayer book Christians, and the Moravians are in their face. John undergoes a personal conversion experience, what is known as the Aldersgate experience in 1738, when he hears a passage from Romans read aloud. And he says in his journal, suddenly my heart was strangely warmed. Now,
wasn't it, I'm trying to remember now what the passage was. It was something about faith and work or something like that?
yeah, I've got it. It's in our class on Romans. When we do the background to Romans, we go through the whole Aldersgate experience there. So we can go get that at a break if you'd like, but I can't just pull it out of my head right now. he undergoes this personal conversion experience near the Aldersgate Church in London, travels to the Herrnhut. The Wesleys spend some time in Georgia. They come back to England, and they partner up with George Whitefield. Now, it's spelled Whitefield, but pronounced Whitfield. He's an early sort of fiery preacher who engages in open-air preaching missions in England. And we're talking thousands of people gathering in a field and somebody preaching for a couple hours. Whitefield and the Wesleys end up separating basically because Whitefield, the Wesleys don't see this as a movement breaking away from the church. They view it as a revival within the church. Whitefield views it as a movement breaking away from the church. He becomes what would be known as a dissenter or nonconformist from an Anglican perspective. The Wesleys don't want to separate. They want to reform the Church of England. Methodism is a doctrinal party that's focused on universal redemption, justification by faith and new birth of the individual, witness of the Holy Spirit in individual lives, perfectionism and satisfaction. So not satisfaction in the sense of a Pelagian idea that we're going to earn our salvation, but that we are always striving to satisfy God by becoming more perfect in our faith, that it's an ongoing project. It's what we would call, if we were speaking in terms of morality, and so this is a parallel example. Morality and faith are two different things. We could talk about a morality of obligation, you must not do this, or we can talk about a morality of aspiration, how I want to be a better person, more giving, more caring, etc. A lot of overlap there, obviously, in faith, both of obligation and aspiration. The perfectionism and satisfaction here, don't think of it in terms of obligation, but in terms of aspiration. The means of grace. So how do we go about doing this? The focus is on prayer, the study of Scripture, fasting, fellowship, works of charity, and Eucharist. We're supposed to pray. We're supposed to study the Bible. We're supposed to fast and deny ourselves. We're supposed to gather as people walking beside each other and following Jesus Christ. We're supposed to engage in works of charity, including to those who do not know Christ. And we're supposed to be centered on the Eucharist, on Jesus' presence in his body and blood. Sound familiar? Well, it kind of describes a lot of what we talk about in modern day Episcopalianism, right? And so we kind of have to beg the question here, what would the church be if there had never been a formal split between the Episcopal Church, or the Church of England, and the Methodists? Well, we'd have a Methodist movement that would be a little bit more sacramentally focused than it is. And we'd have an Anglican movement that would be a little bit more spiritual than it is, a little bit more focused on the Holy Spirit than it is. Now, why did they split? It's because there's no bishop in America. Because of that whole political issue of bringing a bishop over. In New England, there's fierce resistance to a bishop. We've talked about that. But the Wesleys are sending preachers over to America. By 1764. By 1784, they've got enough that they have to have somebody in charge. And so they have a superintendent. And they actually lay hands on him and give him powers as a superintendent. There are parallel develops in England, and Methodism post-1784 becomes a separate church. Yes?
So in McCulloch, he talks about how the precursor for this was the concept that in the early church there were moments where I think it was both bishops and priests were ordaining or whatever, something of that nature. And so today in the Methodist Church, do they have bishops?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So they perhaps in America they started that way, but then eventually went back to having an episcopally.
They do consider themselves, an Episcopal church that way, a hierarchical church. Their governance is a little bit different. The powers of a Methodist bishop are different from those of an Anglican bishop, but you do need to have a bishop around to ordain a priest. You can't just get a group of priests together and ordain a priest, which is theoretically possible in Lutheranism, but not practiced. You use a bishop in Lutheranism as well. Charles leaves the movement in 1761. John remains active, but never considers himself anything other than a priest of the Church of England. They both die as C of E priests. Others start to run with it. Now, Methodism, Pietism, all these things precipitate what we'd call the Great Awakening, which is a later 18th century, early 19th century, that goes in waves. You can talk about the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening. There are writers today who talk about another Great Awakening that's happening now, but not principally in America, more in places like Africa, Southeast Asia, and Christianity is going gangbusters worldwide. It's not doing it in the developed West. And so there are various calls to another Great Awakening in the developed West. Now, it's fueled by evangelical preaching, big open-air meetings, camp meetings that go on for days out in, the wilderness, like Kentucky or something. A distinctive feature of the Christian faith in America very quickly, therefore, becomes an emphasis on individual response, which kind of goes back to the fact that we all came over here to kind of get away from something, right? This is reflecting an American heritage of separatism, dissent, and pioneering, and the influence of Pietism, with the latter, Pietism, becoming a dominant influence in preaching, conversion of heart, individual response, ongoing project of faith, study of the Bible, prayer life, works of charity. Think of the preaching, we're familiar with. We get cultural factors involved here. Scots and Scotch-Irish distrust authority being associated with Englishness, right? If you're a good Presbyterian, you've disestablished your church way before. Authority, anything that looks like a bishop, looks English, looks like the crown. And of course we see a major part of the probably the major stream of immigration into America at the late 18th century into the early 19th century is Scots and Scotch-Irish. So you get a lot of Baptists as well. At this point, Roman Catholicism is a marginal influence. It will remain so until mass immigration begins. Once we start getting a bunch of Irish and Italian, Germans in the 1870s under the Falk Laws, then we're going to see Roman Catholicism become a very important force in American Christianity, although principally as a urban Christian phenomenon. But we're before that. We're going to have to come back the next class to talk about that. We're following the first stream here. Now, we get the rise of a cultural and intellectual movement around this called Romanticism. And the Romantic movement, we can think of it in music, we can think of it in literature. Think of Byron, for example. Lord Byron is a poet, or Shelley. This is where or Keats, going back and looking at Ode on a Grecian Urn, or Byron's epic poetry, or the music of Schubert, or the music of Berlioz. This is this idea that, all that stuff that went before, the medieval stuff, there's a certain romance involved with it, and the romantic ideal becomes a focus of individual struggle to, struggle against the fates and make your own mark. And so tradition becomes more important again. And the idea of transcendence becomes more important again. See how this goes together with the idea of personal experience? How do I experience enlightenment, which was so focused on the brain and rationalism, as something that I feel? Think of all the paintings of the German Romantic painters where there's a guy standing on a mountain looking at the fog and the sunlight coming over it and all that. You know, we're going to go wandering and make our own mark and be Werther and, you know, be dramatic about everything. So that's becoming a dominant force in European culture and literature, and that's obviously having an effect in America. And so we see sort of two streams forming in America. We get the idea of self-reliance. So we get Ralph Waldo Emerson and his famous work on nature. And this is about how we're supposed to carve our own way. We're not dependent on all these social structures around us. I can be my own man. You know, Thoreau's going to go off and live on a pond, right? Right, Walden Pond, and everybody in the 70s is going to rediscover this, and everybody who's in college in the 70s is all about Emerson and Thoreau and be your own person, and the hippie movement really gets a lot of that out of Emerson. But at the same time, you get this desire for transcendentalism, for something that's beyond the human. How do I reach to something spiritual? And so we see Orestes Brownson in Boston writing a lot about the testimony of conversion. He ends up becoming a Roman Catholic and a very important Catholic apologist. But he's a feature in the New England intellectual movements where the Boston Athenaeum gets formed, and people are getting serious and talking about philosophy again. So American Christianity is a push-pull model here of self-reliance and being an individual while trying to reach for the transcendental. Nothing's changed, right? We're all still individuals who are seeking to be spiritual. And there's a tension about how does that relate to being spiritual together? How does that relate to the life of the church? This American contrast or tension between individualism and a focus on the transcendental will remain probably the defining feature of American Christianity. A Catholic identity will arise which is independent of hereditary identity and formation. Now, when I say Catholic here, I'm being very technical in terms of Anglo-Catholicism, because that reach for the transcendental is going to take people into that Catholic identity in a stream separate from Roman Catholicism. It'll be that idea, we got to go back to roots. We got to go back to the church before it split in 1054, the early church, how the church fathers did things. The Catholic identity will arise founded upon the rediscovery of individual faith response set in motion through pietism. So here's the kind of way the Holy Spirit works and how he chuckles at things every now and then. You can't have an Anglo-Catholic movement without the Methodists, because that idea of individual response is going to take hold in a different way in Oxford and Cambridge. And so absent that idea, individual identity, it's still that corporate, here's how we do stuff, and why would I go into a slum and be a Catholic clergyman in a slum? So basically the Oxford movement in England is not possible absent a call away from the pacifism of then contemporary Anglicanism. No Wesleys, no Pusey, no Wesleys, no John Newman, no Wesleys, no John Mason Neale. You wouldn't lump those guys in the same boat, but they are historically, they're part of the same continuum. And that's part of our heritage as an Episcopal church and as a parish that self-identifies as more Anglo-Catholic. So our fellow travelers across the street, our fellow Christians in the Methodist Church, do things very differently from how we do things, but we're part of the same heritage. There are these cross weavings that go along. Which takes us to the Oxford movement. Now, nobody's ever going to do this, but you can also refer to it as the Ritualist movement or the Cambridge-Camden movement. They're all the same. If you want to refer to Anglo-Catholicism in America, you tend not to refer to it as the Oxford movement, but as the Ritualist movement. And if you wanted to mark the start, it would be 1833. Parliament passes what's called the Irish Temporalities Act, which suppresses certain Irish bishoprics. So they're basically reorganizing the church in Ireland because some of these little dioceses have, gone by the wayside and are not self-supporting, and they don't want to, give them more money as a state church. So, the Commons and the Lords get together and they reorganize the church in Ireland. John Keble at Oxford preaches the Assizes Sermon. Now, the Assizes Sermon, there are certain sermons that happen at different times of the year at the English universities. At this point, in order to be a student in an English university, you have to sign an oath that you are practicing Anglican. You have to agree to the 39 articles in the prayer book. That's your oath. This will become a problem for the Anglo-Catholics. And so there are sermons that you have to go to when term starts. There's a Michaelmas sermon, Michaelmas on that side of the Atlantic. There's an Assizes sermon. The Assizes sermon is when the courts open, when the courts start receiving cases and the judges come and sit with the university, and the Assizes sermon is preached. And Keble preaches national apostasy on the 14th of July, 1833. And the question he's basically preaching on is, does Parliament have the right or power to reorder the church? Answer, no. The church is a holy mystery of God, independent of the state. Even as an established church, there are things that Parliament and the Crown can't do. It is sinful to allow state control of the church. Now, that raises the question, what about establishment? Well, this leads to the whole sort of way that we would do by posting blogs and going, we have tracts that are published, pamphlets, right? And this leads to tracts for the times, which is why you also see these folks referred to as tractarians. Keble, incidentally, is principally a poet who's very focused, again, see how Romanticism works here? What went before is now important. He wants to go back and look at the church calendar. Say, how does the whole church year fit together? Why do we have all these seasons? How does this follow the course of Scripture? Who are these saints? How do we use this as a devotional practice? The first tract that's actually published is Thoughts on the Ministerial Commission. It's addressed to clergy. This is not something you're putting out as broadsides to the public. You're going out to clergy first and you're saying, let's look at apostolic succession and how it works. So let's look at the Tractarians. We start out with Keble, who publishes the church year in 1827, in other words, 6 years before the official start of the Anglo-Catholic movement. He's considered the morning star of the movement, just as we said John Wycliffe was the morning star of the Reformation. Other than that, he's a pretty marginal figure. The church year leads to a different way to look at the life of the church, but he's not one of the ongoing publishers who's a controversialist. Then we get Blessed John Henry Newman, who has been declared a saint by the Roman Church. He is the leading author of tracts for the times between 1833 and 1841. He's an apologist, a controversialist. He converts to Roman Catholicism in 1845, and this is a crisis in the Anglo-Catholic movement, because all of those who have been opposed to it said, see, we told you so, they're just Roman agents, right? With Blessed John Mason Neal, who has been declared a saint by the Episcopal Church, whose feast is the 7th of August. He's chiefly responsible, Newman and Neal, for the revival of religious life in Anglicans. So we start getting monks and nuns again. We get Neal establishing Sackville College, which is nuns, and they have Eucharistic adoration. He's the first Anglican clergy to reserve the Blessed Sacrament. He ends up being inhibited by his bishop and being prosecuted. He's not allowed to function as a priest for 21 years. This ends up in the Privy Council on appeal, and the way he gets to continue to function is that Sackville College is recognized as a religious peculiar not under the bishop's jurisdiction. So he becomes the ordinary of a peculiar, which is technically what any religious monk or a nun who's a prior or a prioress is, an ordinary of a peculiar. And you can make jokes about that with seminary deans and our abbesses in the diocese. It sounds like a Gilbert and Sullivan song. You know? Newman is a very influential preacher. In his edition of the Diary of R.H. Froude, that's how that's pronounced, Froude, he refers to the English Reformation as an unfortunate thing. And in response, the Oxford Memorial to the Reformation martyrs is erected. You know, if you're a good evangelical Protestant, or the equivalent at the time, you view Newman with alarm and say, no, the Reformation was important, and that's why we're putting up this monument as you go and become a Catholic. Now, it's not until 1841 that the civil disabilities of being a Roman Catholic in England are lifted. The Prime Minister, Lord Liverpool, starts trying by 1829, although he's very much an establishment figure, probably the quintessential establishment figure. But it's a long time coming, and so by 1841, Roman Catholics are allowed to vote. Newman reaches a crisis where he decides that the 39 Articles are problematic as an expression of the faith. And he ends up being condemned, and then finally publicly converts in 1845, continues as a notable preacher, apologist, controversialist, ends up becoming a cardinal Deacon in the Roman Catholic Church. Although he's a priest, there are different grades of cardinals. There are cardinal bishops, cardinal priests, cardinal deacons. He's a cardinal deacon, which means he has slightly different rights in the College of Cardinals, yes?
Is there a short summary of what his loss in confidence in the 39 Articles is?
Well, we could take apart the 39 Articles and, for example, look at articles that make very specific statements about the Eucharist that he would say would question the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. Or we could look at the articles that condemn the doctrine of purgatory or the papacy. So if you are drawn to the Roman expression of Catholicism, you know, you'd have a problem with the 39 Articles. When I was in seminary, there was always a thing going on amongst seminarians. If they had a cassock that had 39 buttons, which ones they'd leave unbuttoned, to say, I don't agree with that article or whatever. We could do that as an aside and take the 39 Articles out and look at that.
In relation to the 39 steps.
No. No. At any rate, so Newman is the first major force in the Oxford movement, but then is moved to the side a little bit, and we get Edward Bouverie Pusey. And so in the American church, for example, if you're going to be really serious about being a self-identifying Anglo-Catholic clergy, you are a member of the Pussy Society, and there are branches of the Pussy Society around that meet at various times. Pussy is going to be most influential in the revival of belief in the real presence in Anglicanism. Now, I want to throw John Mason Neale in there as well. Neale gets sort of ignored in a lot of this because he didn't write as much. What Neale did was he was a polymath who spoke 21 languages and all that, and he focused more on how we live together in Sackville College and, practice our faith in Eucharistic adoration. But most of his writing was the translation of hymns. He's responsible for more than 600 hymns, mainly from Greek and Roman sources. There are 45 hymns in our hymnal that are either written by or translated by John Mason Neale. And so if you want to see his theological effect, you have to look at the hymns, not writing tracts, not writing long works of theology. Unfortunately, his best-known hymn is one of his worst, and it's remembered for the tune and not for the words. Good King Wenceslas looked out on the... which he wrote for some children. He was physically assaulted by a mob because at a funeral the casket had a pall on it with a cross. That was deemed to be popery, and he was arrested. So he spent his short life in ill health and persecuted by church authorities. But he doesn't get enough credit. He and Newman, or Pusey, really focused on the real presence. He actually practiced it more, showed others more. Pusey talked about it more. So I would prefer to call it the Pussy Neale Society, but that's just me. I'm not a member anyway, so I don't get a voice in this. The movement, the Oxford movement, results in an increased focus on parish ministry, appeal to the heart, not to the mind. Can't do that absent a Methodist heritage, right? Got to appeal to the heart. If Newman is the intellectual ideal of Anglo-Catholicism and Keble the pastoral ideal about what happens in a parish and Pusey the devotional ideal, what we see is a movement that results in a revival of religious life and a quest now for East-West Christian reunion, new missionary activity. This is when the SPG starts going out as a Catholic missionary society. This is where we start seeing tentative appeals for the Church of England and the Orthodox Church to work together, appeals that will culminate in the Diocese of Fond du Lac in the early part of the 20th century with Charles Grafton. And we got real close a number of times, real close to intercommunion with the Russian Orthodox. Every time we got this close, some spanner would be thrown in the works from the Anglican side. Most recently, the spanner from a Russian perspective was the ordination of women. Then when we were moving again to some form of rapprochement, the ordination of non-celibate gays kind of messed that rapprochement. And the Russian Orthodox Church has its own problems, don't get me wrong. There is an ongoing dialogue between the Anglican Church in North America and the Russian Orthodox Church. Most recently, the ACNA primate was in Russia and was received by the Patriarch. 4 years ago, the second highest hierarch, the Metropolitan of Volokhomansk, Archbishop Hilarion Alfayev, was at the Neshota House. One of the things that happened there was the Bishop of Fond du Lac, then Bishop Jacobus, gave Hilarion the cope worn by Archbishop Deacon at the Fond du Lac Circus, which we'll come to at the end of today's class. And I was present, and the very stolid Russian face of the Metropolitan lit up like a kid on Christmas. This is a second-order relic of a major Russian saint. I noticed the next day on the Russian Information Agency Novosti website that it was reported as front page news. It never even hit anybody's radar screen over here, but you have this idea of let's go back to roots, the universal church. How do we do this with the Catholics? How do we do this with the Orthodox? Now, and things are put in the way of that, right? By 1893, we're going to see Pope Leo XIII issue his bull, Apostolicae Curae, that says Anglican orders are utterly null and void. So it's not like these efforts at rapprochement are reciprocated in all cases. But what are the 4 marks of the movement, the Anglo-Catholic movement, as identified by Evelyn Underhill, a 20th century English mystic? One is a restoration of Catholic tradition, small t, capital C, and of Catholic tradition, small c, capital T, with the ideal being capital C, capital T. Now, that's my editorial gloss on Evelyn Underhill. She doesn't play with capitalizations. She just says, a restoration of Catholic tradition. I've added that, partly tongue-in-cheek, but partly with all seriousness. This is what people argue about. Is it Catholic with a capital C and we are in communion with the Bishop of Rome and subject to his authority? Is it Catholic with a small c and we agree on capital T tradition, or what, you know?
I was in Kentucky for training, and I went to the Episcopal Church around the corner from the hotel, and I'm walking up, and there's these women coming into the parish as well, and I'm like, Mass is at 5 o'clock, right? And they're like...
They're shocked by you saying Mass.
Yeah, yeah. They're like, this isn't the Catholic Church. And I didn't say anything, but I thought in my head, well, it says different in the creed. Holy Apostolic Catholic Church, yeah.
Yeah, no, I got parishioner very much in my face in Mississippi for referring to our worship as the Mass. And she was most upset. So, you get those arguments, which is why I've played with capitalizations here. But that's the first mark, a revival of Catholic tradition. The second is a revival of sacramental worship. It's not just about preaching. It's not just about teaching. Something's happening at the altar, right? And that's the most important thing that's happening. Discipline in life, spiritual rule. Think of the rule of life we are promoting in the Diocese of Fond du Lac, that it's an active faith, study, prayer, giving, fasting, things like that. And an emphasis on sanctity. Now that's both personal and institutional. In other words, this isn't a meeting house. This is why I will prevent people from bringing a Coke in the church or ask a man to remove his hat. This is a place we set aside. Different rules apply here. This is sacred space. There's some sanctity involved. And we need to identify ourselves with that sanctity. So while I have been, unfortunately, known to use rather salty language at various times, I have caught myself from doing so in the sanctuary, and making those distinctions is actually a partial result of the Anglo-Catholic movement. Yes, Paul?
I guess we talk about it later in the slide about beauty of holiness, but I'm just thinking in those 4 marks, is it the sanctity where that falls under kind of the, I don't know, I'll let you explain, I guess.
Yeah, it is how sanctity is part of life. And so the beauty of holiness would be, how do we participate in how God reveals himself to us in everyday life, as well as in places that we have set aside as sacred. Now, there are characteristic words in Anglo-Catholicism, mystery and awe. We're supposed to place ourselves more in a transcendental place. It's not just practical. There is a recovery of the supernatural reality in Christian life. It's not just about how I try to be a good person. but it's how I'm open to the Holy Spirit. It's how I participate in communion. It's how I seek to follow Jesus, not just because of who I'm trying to be, but because of his presence. There's a flowering of incarnational theology of the church and sacraments. So, who's Jesus' body now? We are. Who are his hands? We are. We're going to go out and do stuff and be Christ. And do that by always having the sacrament present with us in how we gather. This is going to culminate in the 1979 prayer book, where the preface starts out by saying the Holy Eucharist is the principal act of Christian worship on the Lord's Day. Now, there's still pushback to that. If you grew up in a prayer book parish that did morning prayer and you got Eucharist once a month or once a quarter, one of the things is you love morning prayer. And I've had parishioners say to me, why do we have to have Eucharist every Sunday? Why can't we just have morning prayer? More rare here than, say, in Mississippi. The one who really got in my face in Mississippi about why do we have to have Eucharist grew up in a Virginia prayer book parish, right? It's not about the Eucharist. And so once you say it's the principal act of Christian worship, you say we can have morning prayer, but it's in addition to Eucharist, or it's the liturgy of the word for Eucharist. People don't want to lengthen the service at that point. But that's a different focus, and that's because of that incarnational theology and focus on sacraments. So the 1979 prayer book is actually the triumph of the Catholic movement in American Anglicanism. And it goes in parallel a lot with what we'll talk about later in the liturgical movement in the Roman Catholic Church, or the liturgical renewal movement, I should call it. Now, the movement is countercultural, and proudly so. If you're dealing with a sort of passive Anglicanism where you're just born into a certain station and this is the way things work, and you sit there and say, no, we're talking about conversion of individuals, and that includes people in workhouses, this is very countercultural. And so the early Anglo-Catholics make a point. This is countercultural. The church is supposed to be and has been supposed to be from the beginning. So we get stages in development here. First, it's a focus on study, going back to the church fathers. This is why the early Anglo-Catholics are Greek and Latin linguists, some of them also in Syriac. They're going back and saying, what was Ignatius saying about this? What was Polycarp saying? What did, Clement of Alexandria write about? Now, to be fair, if you're going to get an Oxbridge degree in those days, you're probably going to have to learn those languages anyway. But if you're going to really learn them beyond passing an exam and study the original works, it doesn't hurt that you got an Oxbridge education. So it starts out as study, a rediscovery of roots, and then there's this flowering into ritual, the beauty of holiness, how we do things. Do we put a pall on a casket with a cross? Do we put candlesticks on the altar? Do we have clergy vested in a different way? Is there smoke? Are there bells? What is now a tourist center in Cambridge, the Round Church, I'm blanking on the names of the clergymen right now, but what they do is they move the altar and they put it on the east wall. And they're imprisoned for a year and a half as a result. They're charged with a felony. Once you start moving the altar, you're saying something else is going on. It's not so much a meeting about us, that something transcendental is happening. And then it evolves basically into hard work. Now, in parallel with this, in the Roman Catholic Church, you see a figure like Gerard Manley Hopkins, who literally works himself to death in the slums, while focusing on the beauty of holiness. And so we get poems like the Windhover, or Dappled Beauty, or The Wreck of the Deutschland, or things like that, that have become classics of an Anglo-Catholic identity, written by a Jesuit who refers to Henry Purcell as a heretic. You know, there's a little overlap there. His famous poem about Henry Purcell laments how he is listed to an heresy. But in the specifically Anglican expression of this, people now start going into the worst slums in Dickensian England and saying, we're going to take the beauty of holiness in there and let people experience God. Since the preaching is going to be doctrinal, you're not going to reach them that way. You're going to reach them through experience. Again, would this be possible absent the Methodist movement? Possible, yes, but not happening then. If those are stages in development, then let's look at phases. We start out as an academic focus, people around universities. Then it starts moving out into parishes. People rediscover George Herbert and the devotional poetry, which is very parish-based, like the Temple from the 17th century. How you deal with conversion of life in a parish, and then how this becomes a life of service, whether it's missionary or in some works outside of the parish. There's an emphasis on the beauty of holiness because there's an emphasis on transcendence. We're not going to convert people through doctrinal preaching. We're going to let them experience God's presence. If I'm working in a cotton mill in Manchester, in a hellish environment out of a Charles Dickens novel, and now there is pageantry and color and smell, and all my senses are involved, and I get to experience Jesus in the body and the blood, and there's a community being built around me. Whether or not I ever connect with the doctrine, I'm starting to connect with the real presence. There's a concern with social order. How do we live out our faith? So early foci here are Bethnal Green and Shoreditch, some of the worst slums in London. Still not places one would want to go, right? That's where you go plant an Anglo-Catholic parish. If you look at the leading Anglo-Catholic parishes in London, you'd worry about going into those neighborhoods today. There's a emphasis on clubs and guilds for missionary and relief work. You get the working people in to the church and you form, now this is in parallel with other 19th century movements. In the Catholic Church, you know, groups like Sodality or the Knights of Columbus, you get people together and the focus of the community is on the parish. In the Lutheran Church, you get these big Lutheran German churches in New York City that are focused on how everything happens in the parish, and so you get thousands of people identified with relief efforts. If somebody's down on their luck, they're helped through the parish. The parish is establishing schools. This parish has nurses going around. They're caring for the sick and the aged. It's not an exclusively Anglo-Catholic thing, but it is a revival of that idea of transcendence in all of these different expressions of the faith.
You're saying that these other churches are it's happening at the same time, or that they're influenced by the Oxford?
It's happening at the same time.
Okay.
There's a cultural movement that's probably in reaction to the increased industrialization of society. So in art criticism, you've got John Ruskin going around in the Stones of Venice talking about the beauty of medievalism and trying, the whole arts and crafts movement with William Morris comes out of, let's go back to people making things with their hands and artisans and not big machines going and not electric power running everything. There's a reaction to technological development and industrialization seeking to something more personal, more beautiful, more experiential. I'm not being used as a tool here.
So the main influence from this movement is mostly in Anglicanism, and so then in the United States Episcopal Church during that time frame?
No, I wouldn't say that. I'd say it's in parallel with things in Catholicism and Lutheranism, and the social activism of other Protestant churches.
But those that have, I guess what I'm saying is that the effect of the Oxford movement is largely seen
in Anglican
Anglican
churches, yes, very much so, yeah.
Now, I've thrown out one example here. The English Church Union is formed in 1876, and workingmen rally in support of Arthur Tooth. They hold a mass demonstration because he's thrown in prison for ritualism. And so you've got workingmen in a slum district rallying for an Anglo-Catholic clergyman who's being imprisoned for using the benediction of the Blessed Sacrament and having the Blessed Sacrament in a monstrance, which is what? In violation of one of the 39 articles, which says that the sacrament is not to be paraded and held up over the people. So he's prosecuted for that. And what do you have? You've got working stiffs coming out and saying, you know, this is important to our faith. Our next page is just a series of faces here. John Keble, I've given you some takeaways underneath. Personal sanctity and communal incarnation. This is something we do together. We've got, and incidentally, you get a debate over the pronunciation here. The majority on this side of the Atlantic would say John Keble. You will have some people say John Keble. And I've never actually investigated what people say in England. So you've got Blessed John Henry Newman here is painted as a Roman cardinal. And his focus is on transcendence, sacramentalism, and religious life, reestablishment of religious orders. We've got a caricature of Edward Bouverie-Poussy here from Vanity Fair, the real presence and the religious life. And we've got Blessed John Mason Neale here, Eucharistic devotion, religious life, and hymnody. Now, if you go back and think of the really quite dramatic early old hymns in our hymnal, like by the Roman poet Fortunatus, we wouldn't have that absent Neale translating it, or the Greek phos hilaron settings that we have. That's Neale. I thought he died 33. It might be 1851. I'm sorry. He died a young man. He had all kinds of pulmonary problems, and so spent a lot of time on the island of Madeira to try to cure his lungs. That was a good thing in that there was a wonderful library on Madeira of the Lusitanian Church, and it had all the early church fathers in Greek. And so he just dove into that library. But I'll have to double check the dates on his life there. One of those dates is wrong. I believe it's 1851 that he died. It may even be 61, but I'll double check that. And we've got another series of pictures here of figures we haven't talked about yet, but we're about to. And here we go with Blessed Jackson Kemper, Blessed James Lloyd Breck, and Blessed James de Cova. These are all people important in the history of this diocese and in the Anglo-Catholic movement in America.
Wikipedia has Neale dying August 6, 1866.
Okay, well, I don't know where 41 came from then, so scratch it out and we'll correct it on the slides. So he didn't die as an old man, let's put it that way. Right. Well, he doesn't look 23 in that photo anyway. He must have had something happen that probably threw his hyaline membrane off. Maybe it was RSV or something, because as a 12-year-old, he ran 13 miles to intercept a coach that was to take him to school. And so in early 19th century clothing and shoes with a book bag and a suitcase, so something happened to his lungs later. It might have been TB, but nobody ever diagnosed consumption in him. Let's move on then. And
well, what's the importance of Kemper? I see Jackson Kemper, that name, and Noshoda, yeah, and other stuff in the diocese and things of that nature.
well, let's talk about Kemper just a minute. Kemper, and we'll come to some of this in a little bit, is named as the first missionary bishop in the Episcopal Church. And at his prompting, Nashotah House is founded, and he becomes the missionary bishop based out of here to the Northwest Territories. During the course of his life, he will travel more than 400,000 miles on horseback, wearing a sheepskin coat through the weather, founding churches in a lot of places, including as far south as Mississippi. James Odie's supposed to do that. He gets sick. Kemper fills in for him one, summer, and you get a couple churches in Mississippi that way, in Tennessee. Tireless in terms of mission and church planting. His house is part of Nashotah House. I think our speaker at the Walsingham Festival actually lives in that house now, Tom Olson. He didn't start out at Nashotah House, but then that became his base of operations once it actually started getting up and going. Nashotah House was founded by James Lloyd Breck and others. And they're the ones who are sent out to, hack something out of the wilderness, and they spend the first summer kind of like live under skins to try to avoid the mosquitoes that are eating them up. But before we just dive into Anglo-Catholicism that way and a little bit of the focus on things coming out of Nashotah House and General Seminary, let's take a look first at the Mercersburg movement, which is centered on a German Reformed seminary in Mercersburg, Pennsylvania. It's roughly contemporary with the Oxford movement. We talked about how there are cultural forces at work here, pushing it back against industrialization in Germany, in England, a revival of a more mystical practice of Roman Catholicism, that search for the transcendence that's coming a little bit out of a legacy of Romanticism. So this return to origins and emphasis on sacramentalism is part of the background current in Christianity in the West. Christology, a focus on Jesus and how Jesus is incarnated in our presence, is a preeminent concern. I mean, Jesus tells us at Matthew 18:20, where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there I'm present. People start focusing on that. How's Jesus present here? How do we get together and be with Jesus? The Mercersburg movement is ultimately not widely influential, but the historical writings of Philip Schaff will become so. Now, Schaff himself is kind of militantly Protestant. So if you look at his history of the Christian church or his history of the creeds, they're meticulous from a scholarship perspective, but they have a slant. They always view the Roman Catholic Church as basically an aberration and evil. And so he tends to use his evidence to make his case. He's well worth looking at in the history of the creeds. His history of the Christian church is a very incomplete view of Christian history, I guess would be my editorial comment. But the Mercersburg movement ends up not being widely influential. It's just part of the background that's going to result in, as things start coming together in Muhlenberg and at General Seminary, they're aware of the Mercersburg movement. Anglo-Catholicism, now more properly speaking, we've got Romanticism, a revival of philosophic idealism, and the English Catholic movement, all as cultural forces. Now let's be careful when we talk about idealism, capital I. We have a long history in the church of Aristotelian philosophy that gets embodied in St. Thomas Aquinas and scholasticism. Idealism is Platonic philosophy. Ideas are real things. Form, the chair, the form. And so idealism, and Orestes Brownson in America is going to become an idealist philosopher and revive that in 19th century American philosophy. There's a revival in idealism also in England at the same time. If you put that together with the romantic yearning for transcendentalism, if you put that together with what's happening in the Oxford movement and English Catholicism, a lot of forces coming together here. The reality is that the Episcopal Church in the early 19th century is essentially moribund. There are no Episcopal visitations. The clergy are lax. There's general indifference, and there's a large current of rationalism, capital R, which is a philosophical school, okay, which says it's all based on Enlightenment reason, and that trumps faith. Not reason as we know it in theology, but reason, small r, becomes rationalism, capital R. And you have a question.
Moribund, definition?
Yeah.
On death's door. Yes. Not dead, but, you know, getting there.
That bird's not there.
From so much of our scripture based off of a language that had no capitalism at all, it boggles my mind how much we have emphasis
We have
on.
to label things,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. Incidentally, I'm just old enough to remember how in hospitals, what is now known in a really big ER as the quiet room, which is where somebody's dying and where you take people in to see, you know, the dead person. They used to be called the moribund ward. And that's actually a term from World War I military hospitals where you bring people in and say, I can treat that, I can't treat that, keep them comfortable, let them die. That was the moribund ward. So you've got an Episcopal church that is, with few exceptions, just kind of comfortable culturally and marginal. There are signs of revival, but they're found in areas where Anglicanism was never established or favored. So you're not seeing revival in Virginia. You get evangelical revival and zeal embodied in Blessed Philander Chase in New York. And then he goes out to Ohio, has gone to the western frontier and taken the church. You get Alexander Wietz Griswold. You get the church being kind of more pietistic but higher than Methodism. In other words, there's still more of a sacramental focus, and there's still more of a focus on the role of the bishop. Then we get Blessed John Henry Hobart, who's a high churchman in the old sort of high church school, becomes Bishop of New York. And he focuses on the church as a holy mystery. We get the foundation of the General Seminary in New York in 1817, and this becomes the seedbed for a high view of the church and sacraments. And then what happens is we get Tracts for the Times hitting America. And this engenders a reaction. There's party identification. People are identifying as, you know, we're good Protestants or we're more Catholic or whatever. One of the reasons you have a picture up there of Blessed James de Coven. Now, he's later, he's in the 1870s, but he is the one who is twice elected bishop, once of Wisconsin and once of Illinois, and never receives the necessary consents from the wider church to be consecrated to bishop, because he's accused of being a ritualist and of popery. The principal accusations against him are that there are candles on the altar and that he has a choir wearing vestments. If you go to Nashotah House, the window that has de Coven has a bishop's mitre at his feet. It never got put on his head. Tracts of the Times are published. The General Seminary now starts publishing additional tractarian works and commissions 4 students to serve on the frontier under the first missionary bishop, Jackson Kemper. These 4 students found Nashotah House in 1841, which means it's the oldest institution of higher learning in the state of Wisconsin. It's founded as a semi-monastic center for study, worship, and evangelism. James Lloyd Brett goes on to found the Seabury Divinity School in 1857 in Minnesota. In the late 20th century, that will merge with the Western Theological Seminary in Chicago and become Seabury Western, which now essentially doesn't train anybody for ordination anymore. It has a few graduate programs, but it's essentially folded in the last 3 years. Seabury was founded as an Anglo-Catholic institution, Western a little bit less so, and how they came together was an ongoing project. Breck moves on, but Nashotah House now becomes a center to send out missionary priests, and most of the Diocese of Fond du Lac gets founded on the basis of priests or students from Nashotah House, much of the Diocese of Milwaukee and Eau Claire as well. Grace Episcopal Church gets founded, 1847? How do people get to all these places and do this? They walk, or they take a horse. You can find in the, well, they can't afford horses, most of them. Horses are rare and expensive if you're a seminarian. And so you find when somebody comes out to a mission station like Sheboygan, they walk here. You know, it might take you a week. It's 84 miles on the current roads, but people walk, or they'll walk to Fort Howard. And so by the 1840s in Fort Howard, we get the first Anglican nuns in this area that are imported to found the hospital in Green Bay. That's Green Bay.
That's not the Sisterhood of the Holy Nativity, is it?
No, it's not the Sisters of the Holy Nativity. These are nuns from Belgium that are brought into Blessed Sacrament Church. No, not Blessed Sacrament, Christ Church. Christ Church in Green Bay is founded in 1834 as the mother church of the Northwestern Territories. Christ Church lasts until 2004 and then folds. Is sold by the Diocese of Fond du Lac to a large Hispanic Pentecostal congregation and is going great guns as that. A church, yeah. So you get Nashotah House as sort of a seedbed of missionaries, which is why this area from Wisconsin down into Chicago becomes known in the wider church in the early 20th century as the Beretta Belt, because people wear vestments differently and have more Anglo-Catholic ritual and things like that. Still called by the Beretta Belt by some, and so you can still find people in the wider church in seminaries who refer to Fond du Lac as Fond du Lac, the Diocese of Fond du Lac. Why? Well, let's go down 2 slides and we'll come back. Because of pictures like this, the Fond du Lac Circus, which caused a complete scandal in the church in 1900. We'll come back there. Let's go back up for a minute. As I say, Anglo-Catholicism in America is planted by the missionary efforts of Kemper and James Lloyd Breck, centered on Nashotah House. But in parallel, there's a revival in ritualism under William Augustus Muhlenberg. You get what's called the Flushing Institute in Long Island. And then Muhlenberg becomes the rector of the Church of the Holy Communion in New York. He has James Lloyd Breck serving as a seminarian under him, while James Lloyd Breck is a seminarian at General. Ritualism here is embodied as the liturgical movement. Let's do the services this way. Muhlenberg is also an early pioneer of the social gospel. Get out in the slums and work with people. Social justice and economic inequality are important. Now, post-1830s, there is a decline in American prejudice against the Englishness of the Episcopal Church. There's an increase in an intellectual revolt against some of the strictures of Calvinism, and a reaction against the emotional excesses of revivalism. You also get greater education and literacy, and so greater prayer book use. So you get these forces coming together where a church like Church of the Holy Communion can start becoming more prominent in New York, both for the right people and for the right people to do outreach into the slums. And so the Anglo-Catholic movement, you wouldn't necessarily put Muhlenberg as part of the Anglo-Catholic movement, but that return to transcendence, I guess you would put him through General Seminary, yeah. But that return to transcendence very quickly gets allied with outreach to the marginalized. Because of all of these forces, we can see that there are going to be conflicts, because the Episcopal Church, as the prejudice against the Englishness of the church arises, becomes more identified with educated and privileged classes. You have to be able to read to be an Episcopalian. You get Catholic controversies and the Oxford heresy as party identifiers. But the ritualists are the ones who are the most active in domestic mission. The people who are coming out of, I don't want to throw a rock at Virginia, okay, but the people that are coming out of the old sort of Virginia, we go to the right church and have the right way of doing things and it's a cultural identifier. They're not active in mission. They're just not. The people who are active in mission are the Anglo-Catholics. And so while Anglo-Catholicism will remain a minority identifier in the wider Episcopal Church to this day, it sort of pushes the Episcopal Church down the pathway to being an active church again, to the point where in our next class we're going to talk about how by the end of the 19th century the Episcopal Church very consciously tries to identify herself as the bridge between different forms of Christianity. And so we get the building of the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. Well, who made it national? How is it self-identified as a national cathedral where presidents come and we do public liturgies? The Episcopal Church becomes safe. And we get the whole idea under James Hannington of the church idea and how we come together, what's going to become what's called the Chicago-Lambeth Quadrilateral, which says if we can agree on the following 4 points, we can all be Christians together. We have to agree that there are 2 dominical sacraments of baptism and Holy Eucharist. We have to agree on the Apostles' Creed. We have to agree on apostolic succession as it is identified in local practice. And we have to agree on the primacy of Scripture. If we can agree on that, we can all get together and be Christians. So the Episcopal Church becomes safe that way. And then it becomes rich. And then there are people who want to be in the Matins and Mink crowd who show up for the right wine and then go off and do whatever you want to do anyway. So a lot of things come full circle. Now, as the church becomes more marginalized, it's becoming more active again. Whether it's through social outreach from a leftist perspective or from an Anglo-Catholic perspective, it's becoming more focused on missionary outreach. So kind of looks like God's in charge there. Now, let's go back to this picture.
Who's the bishop holding the staff?
Okay, the bishop holding that mitre, or that crozier rather, is Charles Grafton, Blessed Charles Grafton. And the others that you see in here, immediately to his left is Bishop Weller. This is a ceremony that came together for the consecration of Bishop Weller as Bishop Suffragan of the Diocese of Fond du Lac. The idea is Grafton's getting old and feeble, and we need a Bishop Suffragan to travel around as a younger, more energetic man. Grafton will actually end up being bishop until 1913. This is when the Catholic party of the church tends to show up. And so the others in the background here, you've got the Bishop of Chicago, you've got the Bishop of Indiana. On the far left of the picture, you've got the Archbishop of the Polish Catholic Church, which is an important force in Chicago. Now, over here on the far right of the picture, you've got Lord Archbishop Deacon, Lord Archbishop of the Aleuts and North America, and his chaplain is beside him, and then there's another Russian monk there with them. Deacon is the Lord Archbishop of the Russian Orthodox Church in North America. And he is here under the auspices of the Holy Synod. Under Peter the Great, back in the early 17th century, Peter has deposed the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Nikon, because he views him as a threat, in part because the Patriarch uses the term Veliki Gosudar, which means great autocrat, and the Tsar says that's reserved to the Tsar. So the Russian Church is ruled by the Holy Synod, which is a department of state. It's a branch of the crown. That will remain so until 1918. Once the Tsar is murdered by the Bolsheviks, Tikhon will travel back to Russia and be declared Patriarch. He will be imprisoned by the Bolsheviks and die in 1925 in a Gulag camp. And when they dig up the floor in his hut, they find this photograph. He identified with this somehow.
Is that coat? That's not the vestment that
It is.
showed a return to
It is. The cope that Tikhon is wearing in this picture was returned to the Russian Church by Bishop Jacobus in 2010 or 11. It was much shorter. It had been cut down to fit Grafton, who's like 5'8". Tikhon's like 6'3". It was in the old nunnery for the Sisters of the Holy Nativity and had been used by Grafton, so it's technically a second order relic in the Episcopal Church as well. There won't be another patriarch until 1942. Stalin names one to help rally the Russians fight the Nazis, because they don't want to fight for the Communist Party so much. But at any rate, Tikhon at this point is the head of a powerful unified church under imperial patronage in North America. Then it will become a poor and persecuted church for many generations. But his showing up, he does not lay hands on Weller, but he is seated and participates in the ceremony, and there's a huge reaction in the wider Episcopal Church saying a foreign prelate is involved, and these are really people involved in popery. This is brought to a head in a couple other ways. There is a professor at Nashotah House who you have to remember, in 1893 the Pope has declared Anglican orders null. Then about the same time a professor at Nashotah House leaves and takes 4 students with him, and they become Jesuits. And it turns out that the professor was a Jesuit all along and was a double agent. Then you have a case in which, in 1903, in which the Bishop of Central Pennsylvania denies communion to a divorced woman. The priest denies communion to a divorced woman, and the bishop deposes the priest, inhibits him. Doesn't depose him, inhibits him. Because the woman's fairly well connected, like a steel baron in Pittsburgh. And there is no court of appeal in the Episcopal Church. It goes to General Convention. General Convention says, nope, you're inhibited. That priest ends up going to the Russian Orthodox Church in New York and seeking to be incarnated as a Russian Orthodox priest. Grafton has in the meantime traveled to Russia, met with the Patriarch, with the Exarch, has been seated in an Episcopal chair at the Novodevichy Monastery. The Russians are pleased how he venerates icons. Things are tracking along towards intercommunion. Tikhon is ordered by the Holy Synod to reordain the Episcopal priest, to not accept his orders, but to ordain him. Grafton goes berserk and says, you're not recognizing our orders, you're with the Pope, etc., etc. In the archives of the Diocese of Fond du Lac are a number of fascinating telegrams back and forth on this issue, where Grafton is attempting to involve the Tsar, and there are telegrams from the Imperial Chamberlain and the Imperial Ambassador in Washington talking about how the Holy Synod is relating to the Tsar and the Lord Archbishop. And net effect is that Grafton will never talk to Deacon again. But Deacon has this picture with him in the camp when he dies. Grafton is in the center. He's got the crozier, which is the same crozier used by the bishop today at sort of diocesan events. It was recently restored to return the banner on the lamb, which had broken off. Weller is to Grafton's left.
Weller is, okay, is the young dude.
Young dude.
Okay, and then to his right is who?
I'm not sure. We could, if you Google Diocese of Fond du Lac, or if you Google the Fond du Lac Circus,
Okay.
you'll find a link on the diocesan webpage that'll give you all these folks.
Those vestments on that dude to the far left, the Archbishop proposed that.
Yes,
Those vestments.
wouldn't surprise me. I mean, remember, we have vestments in this parish from a Catholic parish.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of stuff that happens that way. And we do not share communion with the Russian Orthodox. The ACNA is perhaps moving in that direction. We do not share communion with the Polish Catholic Church. We do share communion with the Old Catholic Church. And so there's a question about whether we do with the Polish Church or the Dutch Catholic Church. We share communion with the Moravian Church. We share communion with the ELCA Lutherans. And there are party positions on that, and on all these things about apostolic succession. But this caused, as I say, a controversy that lasted a very long time in print and things of that sort. So, where are we? There's a lot left to talk about how the Episcopal Church evolves at the end of the 19th century. There's a lot left to talk about the influence of Roman Catholicism in American Christianity in the 19th century moving into the 20th. Where we're going to take up next time is that sort of development and then moving into the 20th century. But as you can see, we are a pluralistic group of Christians in America from the get-go. Most of it is not identified on doctrinal basis. Doctrine underlies a lot of these disputes, but that's not what people are arguing about. They're arguing about who we are, discipline more than anything else. But they always end up influencing each other. So if you were to show John and Charles Wesley the full-blown Anglo-Catholicism of John Mason Neale, they might not be happy. But the full-blown Anglicanism of John Mason Neale might not be possible absent John and Charles Wesley. And, you know, once we start identifying what we're not, we get into trouble. And we're 8 minutes early, so